Thank you, and thank you all for coming. My name is Rick Orzy, and I'm a partner of Bennett Jones, and I guess I'm your host today. And thank you again all for coming, and we're looking very much forward to hearing from Melanie Phillips. I want to say I've had a long association with the Speakers Action Group. I mean, really long. I was just discussing with Shirley Ann how long it's been going on, and I think it's certainly from day one. But I've been a fan of Shirley Ann Habers for much longer. Where are you, Shirley Ann? I didn't even see you. Oh, there you are. Okay. I think we worked together in the 70s on Soviet Jewry and everything. But I can tell you without reservation that the speakers, and we've had a number of them here, but the speakers that the Speakers Action Group gets are truly informative and worthwhile people. Today is absolutely no exception. In fact, one of the premier, I think. But in my recollection, and we all hear a lot of speakers and we all attend lots of events and we all get frustrated by what we read and what we hear from various people. But the speakers that you can hear through Speakers Action, and I'm positive again, today is no exception, are people in my memory that have truly given me real knowledge that I could use in my life, in maybe debunking what certain other people say, in responding to various things. And I think that's the true test of whether it's worthwhile to come out on a rainy day and sit through a lunch or go last night to Holy Blossom or whatever. And that is the defining characteristic that I have from Speakers Action. That's why I'm involved, and that's why I continue to wish it strength and growth. And certainly Bennett Jones is happy to host today. So thank you very much. Let me just make one stupid technical announcement. That is, if people were asking about garbage cans, all those white areas back there, if you pull it out, there's a garbage can if you're interested. Or you could just put stuff on the counters and take it away.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. If you don't know me, my name is Daniel Bordman. First question, no, I'm not one of Shirley Ann's grandkids. I work for the Speakers Action Group, so I'm in charge of social media, and it's been great. I just joined this year, so I'm new, and reasons and events like this are why I'm so happy to be part of Speakers Action Group, because we do some very important work in my opinion. And I also, on behalf of the whole organization, we really want to thank Rick Orzy and Bennett Jones for hosting this event, because we know that sometimes people say things. We really appreciate it being part of the battle of ideas. I'd also like to thank the Speakers Action Steering Committee, in particular Debbie Rose, who even Melanie can attest to this, has spent 24/7 on this event. So everything you see in front of her is really, at least half of it's thanks to her. So thank you, Debbie. All right, so we're here to talk about the world turned upside down, the role of the media. I think if we all met in 2015, 3 years ago, we would all agree that we did not see 2018 coming. No one would have predicted things like Brexit or Trump. And what is the role of the media? I think we have the perfect speaker for that today, as Melanie Phillips has spent a lot of time on the BBC. Sometimes they give her half an hour. Sometimes she put up there and someone says, we should run the economy on peace and love. Here's Melanie to say why love is bad. And it really puts in perspective, like, what is fake news? We all talk about it. Is it online media? Is it the mainstream media? Is it outright lies? Or is it just presenting things in a bit different of a way? So we face all these complicated challenges. We live in a world where I went to university where Zionism is like supporting Nazi Germany. Real quotes. Because I have heard that Hitler was a Zionist. This is absurd. This is absolute absurdity. So this is why Speakers Action Group was formed, to combat bad ideas like this. And if you're interested in following us, we have great events coming up. On March 26th, there will be a screening of the film The Fight of Our Lives, where Melanie is playing a starring role. So you are here to see a movie star and journalist, all right? So cheap lunch. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce her, because you might know her as an award-winning journalist. She's written for the Times of London, the Sunday Times, the Observer, even the Guardian, although I don't think they're on the best of terms anymore. But guys, please just give a warm round of applause for one of my favorite journalists, Melanie Phillips.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. Hello, everybody. It's a very great pleasure to be here. And may I add my thanks to Rick and Bennett Jones and to the Speakers Action Group and to the heroic Debbie, with whom I have weathered a few crises. And thanks to her immaculate organisation, I'm standing here in front of you today. I'm very pleased to be here. The topic, as you've heard, is the role of the media in our very strange times that we're living in. And it's very good of you to have a representative of fake news to come and address you. But we can perhaps talk about some of the things I'm going to raise in more detail when I've conclude my remarks. I hope we'll have some interesting questions and further discussion about all these matters, because the role of the media is only obviously part of the story. It's a very important part, but the things that I think concern so many of us about the media reflect things which should and do concern us about the culture that the media is merely the public face of, and you can't really disentangle the two. I think I'd like to start my remarks with a little anecdote from the time that I was working for Guardian newspapers, which actually I worked for nearly 20 years. And as I say to my erstwhile colleagues at The Guardian, it is The Guardian that made me what I am today. And mysteriously, they aren't terribly pleased to hear that. But anyway, when I was working at The Guardian in the mid-'80s, there was, the wars going on in the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, all that sort of thing. I've forgotten now which stage this was that I'm now about to tell you about. But there was a period where, war was going on. And there was a particular journalist at The Guardian who wrote like a dream. She was a marvellous craftsperson of words. Her work won award after award. It was always on the front page. She was a war reporter, and she was in Central Europe during this period. She was in Bosnia. And I remember in particular one piece she wrote, which was on the front page, which was particularly affecting. There had been some terrible, tragic event, a lot of people dead, and she described an affecting scene in a village at the heart of all this trouble. She described this pathetic convoy of trucks coming in, and on the back of one of the trucks she described in detail how the back of the truck was filled with refugees, and she described how they looked, and the women were like this, and they were wearing their headscarves, and they were bowed, and the children were subdued, and there were no men because they'd been killed. It was, it was very affecting, and it was completely untrue. She hadn't been there. She hadn't seen it. She had made it up. And at The Guardian, where you will be amazed to know some people had some vestiges of conscience, people said, can this be right that we've printed something which is, not actually true? And other people said, no, it's fine. It's absolutely fine that we have printed this because it is the broader truth. What was the broader truth? The broader truth was what everybody knew. It was unarguable that the Serbs were the bad guys, the Muslims were the victims. That was the broader truth, and anything that illustrated that broader truth was fine, because it was illustrating the broader truth. So the fact that it was a lie wasn't a lie at all. It was actually true. This was the mindset. Now, that mindset didn't come from nowhere. It came directly from what became the orthodoxy in the world of the intelligentsia. When it started, I can't tell you, but certainly I noticed it around the mid-'80s, which became known as postmodernism. And the essence of postmodernism was that there was no objective reality, and there was no such thing as objective truth. You may have read The Closing of the American Mind, and at the beginning of it, I can't quote the precise words, but he says something like, everybody knows, every single student in America knows one thing for absolute certainty. There is no objective truth. And I have encountered over and over again younger people than myself, for there are some, who say anybody who thinks that such a thing as objective truth is basically stupid. They're basically intellectually deficient. it's so unsophisticated. Because if you're clever and intelligent and educated, you know. I mean, objective truth? By what standard? Everything is a matter of opinion. It's my narrative, it's your narrative. We have rival narratives. And my narrative is not any better than your narrative. And I found this when I, from time to time, would go up to my colleagues at the Observer, which was owned by The Guardian, or The Guardian, and I would say, well, we printed X, but actually it's not true, because here is the evidence, here are facts which show that what we've printed is actually wrong. To which the answer was, no, these aren't facts. This is your opinion of what facts are. And my opinion is different. So my opinion wins. And you couldn't get through this barrier that there was such a thing as evidence and facts, which was a different category completely from opinion and subjective viewpoints. We are in a culture where the subjective rules. What I believe is true. You can't say it's not true because it's what I believe, because what I invent for myself, my own narrative, the expression of my inalienably authoritative personality, is the valid thing. And consequently, everything is subjective and everything is a matter of feelings. What I feel is more important than what is. I feel, therefore I am, almost. And you feel something different. Well, let's be very solicitous about your feelings. Except that if your feelings are that I'm wrong, well, I can't have that. Because we can't have that at all, because my feelings are inviolable. And so that's where we've got to more generally. Everything is a matter of opinion, everything is a matter of narrative, everything is fluid, there is no objectivity. This, of course, is absolutely inimical to what I, being so ancient, was brought up to believe in my own personal family household life, and then as a training journalist. It was almost the first thing we were taught when we were trained as journalists back in the 70s, that there were facts which were sacred and there was opinion, and you must not muddle the two. It was famously said of The Guardian, where it was said, opinion is free, but facts are sacred. It was a phrase associated with the legendary founder of The Guardian, or legendary former editor of The Guardian, C.P. Scott. Opinion is free, but facts are sacred. No, The Guardian, it was a running joke, but it was true, that opinion was sacred and facts were free. And that was how I found The Guardian after a while. But that's a sort of another story, how I came to change my view about The Guardian and the left. And if you are interested to know that story, may I make a small commercial break? I've actually just had published in America, at the end of January, a book called Guardian Angel, which is a personal and political memoir of how and why it took me a very long time to break away from The Guardian thinking and the left and turn into what I became today. And that's been published in America. I was hoping to bring some books to Canada to entice you to purchase some, but due to a left-wing conspiracy, the books never got here. Anyway, so everything's a matter of opinion. However, only one opinion is permitted. My opinion is the same as your opinion? No. Only one opinion is permitted, and that is what I would call a left-wing groupthink opinion, which is a view of the world which is everything to do with the West is bad, the Western nation state is bad because the Western nation state gives expression to Western values. Western values are bad because they're basically based on the Bible, which, as we all know, is a handbook of misogyny, homophobic bullying, rape, exploitation and war. The fact that the Bible is actually the handbook of loving your neighbour as yourself, putting other people first, and living according to rules of morality which privilege others rather than you. And it's actually a handbook of love, which was a revolutionary concept, not to mention a handbook of reason, but let's put that to one side. That is, of course, deemed to be really the ravings of an extreme fundamentalist Old Testament fanatic, which, of course, I am. So only one opinion is permitted, which is left-wing groupthink, which, as I say, is anti-capitalist, anti-West, anti-America, anti-Israel as the pawn of America, anti-everything to do with the values that underpin the West, which is basically traditional family, the idea that you transmit through education the values of the West down through the generations. You can't do that because that is actually transmitting racism and colonialism, because the West is racist and colonialist. So if you use your education system to transmit the values of the West, you are transmitting racism and colonialism, so you can't do that. And all that, I'm sure you don't. In Canada, you don't need me to tell you about all this. You have it like we have it in Britain. But that is the dominant position, that is the orthodoxy. And coming more to the current day, there are the issues of, in Britain, Brexit, on which only one view is permitted, even though you may find this rather perplexing, given that Britain actually voted to come out of the European Union by 52% to 48%, but nevertheless the 48% are all represented in all the media, and consequently the perceived wisdom is that something terribly peculiar happened, and the real thing that has to happen is Britain has to remain in the European Union. And that is the one narrative that is permitted. The fact that the majority of people voted against that is considered to be proof that the majority of people are basically stupid. And it's said over and over again. So there's Brexit. There is global warming. I'm sure I'm treading on corns here, but you cannot ever say that there is any room for any skepticism, any argument, any evidence that will contradict man-made global warming theory, because everybody knows that the science is settled. And if you are a scientist, you will know that the science is never settled. And that is itself an anti-scientific point of view. But what do I know? I'm an arts graduate, I'm a journalist, I know nothing, and consequently anything I say about science is anti-science. So I hope you get that right. And then the other issue, which I'm sure is on everyone's minds here, or a lot of people's minds here, is this issue of the media's attitude to Israel, which in Britain is unprecedentedly and obsessionally, one-sidedly of the view that Israel is the principal actor in the region. Nothing of significance happens in the region unless Israel is actually involved. If thousands of rockets are coming from Gaza and hitting southern Israel, that's not a story. It's not important. That's what we expect. It's only their right because they're all oppressed. But as soon as Israel responds with its own military attempt to stop this onslaught, that is where the story, for journalists, that's where the story begins. And I've actually heard people on the BBC say, the story begins today because Israel has launched whatever it is into Gaza. The story begins today. There wasn't a story before. So thousands of Israelis in shelters in southern Israel, not a story. Not a story. It's normal. What do they expect? That's not a story. So those things are of one, only one view is permitted. And then, of course, you have President Trump. And you don't need me to tell you, only one view is permitted, and I hope none of you have the opposite point of view in this room, which is basically that he is a lunatic, he's a Nazi, he's a white supremacist, he's Ku Klux Klan, he's anti-Semite, he's completely crazy, he's deranged, and all the rest of it. The double standards of the media are quite astounding when it comes to the American presidency. Because, for the 8 years of President Obama, nobody could actually criticize President Obama in the media. Nobody did. Any criticism was deemed to be racist, because the people who were saying that, of course, all they could see was the color of the man's skin. They did not treat him as a human being, let alone a president. They treated him simply as a black man. And they called people who criticized him racist. They were the racists, because they could only see him as a person of color. Put that to one side, the fact remains that in the period of his presidency, all kinds of stuff was happening which was never, ever, ever written about. We read today about, the Russian influence, the reset with Russia. Nobody turned a hair. Nobody turned a hair. Nobody said, what the hell's going on here? Reset with Russia? What is this? Nobody turned a hair when he went and grovelled in Saudi Arabia. Nobody turned a hair when he empowered Iran. That was considered absolutely right and normal. Of course you should empower Iran. The only people who didn't want to empower Iran were lunatics like me, who are warmongering Zionist nutcases. That's the accepted wisdom. And I was looking at this with absolute astonishment because when Obama first surfaced as a possible Democratic presidential candidate, before he won his presidency the first time, I was writing a blog. And I was writing it on the basis of what I was reading, not the mainstream media, but all kinds of stuff, and including what he himself had written and said, his own autobiography, the people that he followed, what they'd written and said, his friends, his associates, his background as a community organizer, his record as a community organizer, as a legal advisor to the Acorn movement, which had thuggishly enforced the turnout, which skewed various elections. I was reading all of this. I was reading about his associations, and I was writing my blog saying this man is one of the most dangerous people ever to have emerged in American politics. And it came to the eve of the presidential election, and not a word had been said in the mainstream media about any of this at all. He was just, the great hope of the future. And he was described as Jesus. I mean, he was described in that way. Somebody called him. Somebody said, this is Jesus, come among us. And I was writing, and on the eve of his election, I wrote a blog saying, I can't believe America is going to do this. And when it did, I wrote again, and I said, I can't believe it's done this. Scroll on, and now everyone's saying, well, who knew? Who knew? I didn't know. I didn't know what kind of man this was going to be. And then you look at what's happening with President Trump. Whatever you think about President Trump, and I have great reservations about his fitness for office, his character, and all the rest of it, but you look at the double standard and the way in which he is misreported, the way in which lies are told. I mean, I'm reading what he's actually saying, and then I'm reading what people are saying he said. Often the two bear absolutely no comparison. So this extraordinary double standard in the press is really something to behold. And even more seriously than that, I mentioned the Russian conspiracy theory, this idea that there were ties which shouldn't have happened between the Trump campaign and Putin's Russia. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. All I do know is that at this moment, there has been no evidence that that was the case. But it may be the case. But so far, there is no evidence that was the case. And I was brought up to believe that if you're a reporter, if you're a journalist, you report on the evidence. So no evidence, and yet the press goes on and on and on about the fact that there were these ties, and it's only a matter of time, and everything is reported through the prism of there were these ties. But at the same time, we see this unfolding scandal involving the Democratic Party and its ties to Russia through this infamous dossier, the Christopher Steele dossier. Christopher Steele employed by Fusion GPS, which was itself in some sort of financial connection with Russian elements. I'm reading all this in certain blogs and websites. Mainstream media, it's not being reported at all, except to say there is a conspiracy theory which is being peddled by the extreme right in order to destroy the Mueller investigation. That's how it's being presented. I mean, the double standards are quite remarkable. Now, in Britain and America, there's a kind of hysteria about President Trump in the media. On the BBC, Glenn Beck, the erstwhile shock jock who's had a kind of epiphany for some reason, and he decided that his previous persona was something he regretted, and he's become a great critic of President Trump. Okay, so he was on the BBC because he was a great critic of President Trump's life. We rejoice over the sinner that repents, do we not? So there he was on the BBC. as the critic of President Trump. They would never have had him on when he was Glenn Beck as we remember him. But now he has seen the light and he's done due penance and he's a critic of President Trump. He's given a respectful hearing on the BBC. So up he comes, being interviewed about the awfulness of President Trump. Now, you will know, if you know of Glenn Beck, you will know that he's never, ever lost for words. Torrents of words emanate from him the whole time. And the interviewer, who is a respected BBC foreign correspondent, said to him, "So, Glenn Beck, do you actually think that Trump is actually deranged?" And there was a silence. There was a silence, and there was an intake of breath, and I could just hear Glenn Beck thinking, what? What was I just asked? Because whatever you think about President Trump, to say, do you really think he's deranged? Like, come on now, we all know, you know. I mean, let's stop beating about the bush. The man is clinically insane, isn't he? That's the assumption that the BBC makes. And Glenn Beck took a deep breath and said, well, I would not have used that word myself. And then he went on to make perfectly reasonable, harsh criticisms of Trump. Now, that's the BBC for you. And then you look at what the Associated Press, the news agency, the website Powerline reported on this. And it is astonishing, and I must just read bits of this to you. Fox News reported some time ago that American spy satellites had detected the North Koreans loading anti-ship cruise missiles onto a patrol boat. Right? So it's a big thing, further alarming evidence of North Korea's alarming behaviour. The Associated Press was not interested in that. What it was interested in was the tweet by President Trump. And it reported thus. It said, Trump retweets Fox report based on anonymous sources. Okay, so anonymous sources, so we don't really believe the report about North Korea. The problem is Trump's tweet, not North Korea. The problem is Trump's tweet. President Donald Trump has retweeted a Fox News report based on anonymous US intelligence sources, despite his Attorney General's pledge to clamp down on government leaks. Just think about that for a moment. Government leaks? Yes, the Attorney General of the United States of America was concerned about leaks from North Korea? I think not. And yet AP twisted it so that President Trump's tweet had gone against his own Attorney General's advice or determination to clamp down on government leaks. Trump has repeatedly complained about leaks of government information to the press. Last week, Attorney General Jeff Sessions vowed a crackdown, arguing such leaks could harm national security. Get your head around this. Trump tweets about the danger to American security from North Korea, and the AP is arguing that Trump has compromised national security by leaking this. I mean, this is crazy or what? And then AP also went on in a different story to equate Trump with North Korea's Kim. He said, the AP said that Trump had tweeted, famously, North Korea had best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. That was Trump's tweet. And then AP went on to say, if the rhetoric sounded similar to North Korean pronouncements, it was. Here is a look at some past comments by Pyongyang. There then followed 5 comments by Pyongyang, which were equated with President Trump tweeting, I will rain down fire and fury on you if you threaten America. Now, I mean, malice? This is beyond stupidity. This is a way of looking at the world which is so twisted and so anti-West as to be almost beyond belief. Now, why is all this happening? Why is this groupthink happening? Well, long story, but in brief, I believe that what's happened to the progressive side of politics in the West, both in America, in Britain, and in Canada, is that in the drive to obliterate biblical religion from the public sphere on the basis that it's A, stupid, and B, bad. All religion is bad. What's come in its place is not the ideas that are ascribed to the Almighty, but ideas that are basically man-made. And these ideas we call ideologies. And they are ideas which drive everything before them. They are ideas which can't be challenged because they are so powerful. Why are they so powerful? Because they are all, in their very different ways, embodiment of the understanding, or belief rather, that they embody a drive to the perfection of the world. So if you think about it, multiculturalism. Multiculturalism means that every culture is on equal level with everybody else. Consequently, nobody can be prejudiced about anybody else. Consequently, you kind of remove prejudice from the human heart altogether. Environmentalism. And again, I apologize for treading on precious corns. I'm not talking about the care for the environment that we should all have. We should all be very aware we are all stewards of our environment. We should look after it. We should be careful with it, and so on. But what I'm talking about is what I would call deep green ecological environmentalism, which is a philosophy of life, a philosophy of the world. And it's based on the idea that the only thing wrong with planet Earth is the human race. And that in order to save the planet, you have to basically hit the human race. The human race has to be prevented from doing stuff because the most important thing is to protect the Earth. And at the very bottom of this is the idea that the human race has been placed in this invidious position over the natural world because of the Bible, which set man in dominion, famous word, dominion over the Earth. And that has been interpreted by deep green ecological environmentalists. That word dominion has been interpreted as a kind of divine imperialism or colonialism, that gives mankind a free pass to ride roughshod over the planet and trample it and destroy it. It's completely untrue, but that's how it's seen. And that idea, because deep green environmentalists believe that their governing idea is all about saving the planet from extinction, anybody who questions that, anybody who questions any part of that, is automatically not just wrong, but a bad person, because that person wants to not help protect the environment, not help prevent the world from destroying itself. And so that person who questions any part of deep green environmentalism has to be literally suppressed, prevented from speaking, because that person embodies evil incarnate. And I don't exaggerate. People who oppose or are skeptical of man-made global warming theory are called deniers, in a specific attempt to equate the denial of man-made global warming theory with those who deny the Holocaust. So it's a specific attempt to equate them with genocidal lunatics. And that is absolutely par for the course, and it's not challenged. When it comes to journalism, I come from Britain, I would like to talk a little bit about the BBC. The BBC is terribly, terribly important. The BBC is, without question, the single most influential and important media organisation in the world, because it is regarded universally as a kind of kite mark of objectivity and trustworthiness. And consequently, people believe it. They don't believe anything else in the same, to the same degree. So it has a tremendous importance and a tremendous responsibility. And if you say to the BBC hierarchy, the people who run the BBC, if you say to them, you know, your whole way of approaching news is absolutely corrupt because you have left-wing groupthink, and they all say, well, what do you mean? Give me examples. Give me examples. And you say, okay, here is the edict that you issued some years ago, that when it comes to man-made global warming, there can be and will not be any skeptic afforded any time whatsoever on air because the idea cannot be challenged. That was an edict at the BBC. Inimical to journalism. Inimical. And you say to them, so there's that example. Then you say to them, look at Brexit. Look at Brexit. It is perfectly possible to undergo the ordeal by torture that I often undergo to listen to the BBC's flagship radio programme, the Today programme, which goes on every weekday from 6 to 9 a.m. It's 3 hours of hell, because it's 3 hours of groupthink. And it's perfectly possible to listen, as I have done on more than one occasion, from 6 till 9, because I'm a real glutton for punishment, and to hear, if Brexit is, the story of the day, because there's been some development, so you can hear 4, 5, 6 items in that period from 6 to 9 a.m. on Brexit. And it's perfectly possible, as I have done, to listen from 6 to 9 to all those items on Brexit, all those discussions, all those items, and not hear one single voice that supports Brexit. Not one. No attempt at balance whatsoever. Because to oppose Brexit is balance. And this is the terrible point about the BBC. The people who run the BBC take their position very, very, very seriously. They understand that they are stewarding this uniquely important and uniquely powerful and influential global media brand. And they understand they have a sacred duty of trust to protect and preserve its guiding principle, which is objectivity and fairness and truth and accuracy and all those great things that lie at the heart of proper journalism. They really believe that is their role. They are genuine. They don't despise that. They take it seriously. And they believe they are fulfilling it to the letter. When you give them this evidence of Brexit, Israel is the same thing. Israel is the aggressor in the region, and everything follows from that. Global warming, a variety of things. The Conservative Party, has to be almost like the Labour Party, otherwise it's considered extreme. You put all these things to it, the coverage of Trump, coverage of America, coverage of Obama, all these things, and they nod along and they say, I can't see what the problem is that you have with our reporting on this. And because they think they're listening carefully to what I'm saying, or someone like me, and they're saying, well, they're saying that, she's saying that because, she believes all this stuff. She believes there is actually an argument to be said against global warming, man-made global warming. She believes there's actually an argument to be said for Israel being the historic victim in the region. She believes there's an argument for saying that President Trump is not clinically insane. She is an extremist. She's off the planet. She's off the graph. So it's not surprising she's complaining. Because from their point of view, where they're standing is the centre. Where they're standing is objectivity and truth. And that's because, more generally, our culture has presided over a shift, in my view, a shift in political gravity, so that what was once considered left-wing is now considered absolutely bog-standard centre, and what was once considered centrist is now considered far-right bordering on Nazi. And that's how it's all being framed. So if I say, excuse me, there's bias here about this, this, and this, I am written out of the script altogether. It's by definition, I am damning myself as being an extremist. And so this is very, very difficult because the media hunts in packs, it's self-referential, they have a kind of groupthink, they're all looking at what each other is saying, and none of them is stepping out of line, so it kind of reinforces the idea that where they're standing is the true centre ground. And so when it comes to the reporting of Israel, this is very much what happens there. Except that there are one or two points I would make about that which you may not be familiar with. People who don't work in the media are not familiar with the way the media works, which actually also has a very great impact upon the way in which Israel is reported. If you are a journalist from London and you are sent out to cover the Middle East by your newspaper, you will be sent out to deliver a story. That story, everyone knows what the story is. The story is Israel is the aggressor in the region, and it's the settlements that are the problem, the obstacle to peace, and Netanyahu is himself the obstacle because he is not dealing with the settlements, and the Palestinians, all they want is a state, and if there was a state, there would be peace tomorrow. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows it. That's the story. And so everything is framed through that way. And so if you're a journalist, you're sent out to the Middle East, that's basically the story you're going to bring back. And the story you're going to bring back is we're not interested in anything that's happening until and unless Israel starts firing the missiles. Then it's a big story. Otherwise, we're not interested. So Israel starts firing the missiles, let's say, in Gaza. And then you're having to deliver the story. So what do? You are a British journalist, you don't speak Arabic, you don't speak Hebrew, but who cares about that? You don't speak Arabic. How are you going to get the story? You have to go to people who speak Arabic. And there is no shortage of willing people who speak Arabic. They will come to you in droves. They will be charming, they will be helpful, they'll be polite, they will be super helpful. They'll say, I can interpret for you. Not only can I interpret for you, I have a car, I will drive you to all kinds of places, and because you're with me, you'll be safe, and I can show you the good stories. I can show you the victims, I can show you the weeping mothers and the weeping whatevers, and I can show you the devastation. Come with me, and I will give you the story. And the journalist wants the story because he's got a news editor at his back, or her back, saying, where's the story, where's the story? And there's only one story, that's the story. And so they go out, and they bring back these stories. They haven't got a clue, not a clue what they're being told. It's in Arabic. It's being translated for them. They haven't got any idea at all. They don't care because it's the story. And what's more, if they should query the story, which sometimes happens, they are threatened with their lives. And there have been occasions where the government of Israel has actually gone into Gaza and pulled them out, Western journalists, because the government of Israel has understood from its intelligence that there is a major threat to journalists and they have to come out immediately. The journalists are pulled out in order to continue with their sacred mission of being unfair and biased and appalling about Israel in everything that they write. So this is, put it mildly, a downer when it comes to the journalists actually telling the truth about Israel. And there's an even more important point, which is that much if not most of the reporting about Israel or the Middle East comes from what's called news agencies. That's to say, agencies which supply a lot of newspapers with the same story. And those news agencies are staffed, when it comes to the reporting of Israel, exclusively by Arabs. And they put in stuff that nobody knows whether it's true or not, but nobody cares, and it goes straight into the newspaper. And so that's a sort of mechanism for maximizing the spread of this kind of propaganda approach. There was a particular example which I just want briefly to tell you about, which you may have read about, the case of Mohammed al-Dura. Do you know about this case? Do I need to tell you that Mohammed al-Dura was the child who was reportedly, according to a report on France 2 television, it showed him being killed by the Israelis in some demonstration, and he was shown in an iconic picture cowering against his father, and then you see the child slump, and you're told that there's been 25 minutes of firing by the Israelis, and you see the child slump, and then the reporter says he's dead. And that picture not just went around the world, but actually was used directly. That picture was the direct cause of the murder of countless innocents. When Daniel Pearl was beheaded, one of the things that his captors said was, "This is for Mohammed al-Dura." The image was used to incite mass murder, and it was a lie. It was a lie, because, cut a long story short, I sat in a courtroom in Paris, and I watched part of the missing footage, the footage that France 2 had not transmitted of that incident. And it was very apparent from the start that this demonstration was not a demonstration at all. It was a staged carnival. There was a carnival atmosphere. You saw the participants who were having a great time. There were children on bicycles. They were larking about in front of the camera. And you saw the cameras positioned, in position, on tripods, waiting to take the pictures that would give the Western media the story of the Israelis killing Palestinians. And then you saw that at some point there was firing, but you saw most of it was not under fire. At some point there was firing, and then you saw, on this footage, you saw Palestinians falling to the ground and being put onto stretchers and bundled into an ambulance. Very dramatic, except there was something wrong with this picture. There was no blood. There was not one single evidence of any injury whatsoever. And nobody watching this ever thought, why isn't there any blood? Because they were being told, this is a demonstration, the Israelis are firing, people are being injured, so they believed it. And then you see Mohammed al-Dura, the child, holding on to his father. And there are bullets. And then you see the child slump. And the reporter says, he's dead. And then, in that Paris courthouse, you see what then happened. The child is lying on the floor, he's dead. And then you see the child do this. And the film was stopped, and France 2's lawyers were asked, why did you say the child was dead? He was alive. We just saw him move. And the response from the lawyers was, he was dead. The movement that we saw on the film just now was the involuntary movement of a dead body. That image has caused endless mass murder, as I say. And one has to ask oneself, what is in the minds of the reporters and the cameramen who are filming all this? Because it's called Pallywood. And there are many examples of Pallywood. Dolls arranged for the cameras with tomato ketchup on them. And this is dead Palestinian children. And it's put out on the BBC as dead Palestinian children, alongside Palestinian children who really are dead, unfortunately. Don't the reporters or cameramen know what they are seeing? Of course they do. Of course they do. They don't care, because it's the broader truth, isn't it? The broader truth is that Israel is the aggressor. So it doesn't matter. It's not a lie. It's the broader truth. So my conclusion is this. How do we deal with all this? It's very difficult. How do we pick our way through this? How do we know what is fake news and what is real news? And it is extremely difficult. We now have a situation where the good side of the internet is that this monopoly power of the propaganda of the mainstream media, which tells lies, is now challenged every day. We can all go onto the internet, we can find endless websites and people putting stuff out, and we can see the lies. On the other hand, the internet is full of lies. A lot of this stuff that's on the net, social media included, is lies. It's rubbish, either ignorance or malice, whatever. It's lies. So how do we all pick our way through this? I find this very difficult, and I'm a trained journalist. And you can spend your life trying to pick your way through this. I would simply say, and also we have another problem, which is that Facebook and Google and YouTube also are possessed of the same mindset, and they are busily trying to shut down people whose voices need to be heard because they're telling the truth. And this is an absolute nightmare. So there's no easy answer to this, and I just don't have an answer. All I can suggest is that people might consider doing what I try and do, which is to treat everything with skepticism. Believe nothing. Believe nothing you read, except, of course, what I write. Believe nothing. Approach it from the position of, okay, is this likely to be true? And you can often apply all kinds of tests which are a guide. First of all, you look at the internal logic of what's being said. What's actually being said here? There's a lot of noise, a lot of screaming and shouting in this story, a lot of allegation. But what is the evidence? And quite often you can see immediately that the evidence isn't there. It's an assertion, but it's not backed up by actual evidence. Or you can see that the assertion is actually contradicted by the available facts. Or you can see that the logic doesn't work. And so that alerts you to the fact that this is not likely to be true. Correspondingly, what I increasingly do, and who has the life and time to do this, but it's necessary if you want to find out what's going on, you have to go as much as you can to original sources. So, for example, the Mueller indictments, the indictment against the 13 Russians. As soon as there was going to be an indictment, there is an indictment, absolute hysteria in the media and on social media. And, immediately there was a kind of tsunami of information, and it was coming at you from all angles, and people were hysterical, and you cannot tell who is telling you the truth about this. So you ignore it all. Go to the indictments. Go to the Department of Justice. Look up the indictment. Read the indictment for yourself. Try as much as possible to go to the original sources. This is by no means an adequate solution, to put it mildly, but that's how one has to kind of pick one's way through this. I find there are certain sites that I come to trust. I trust them because of experience that what they say one week is actually proved to be true a year later. So you kind of trust these people, but you must never let your guard down. But there are certain sites that I find particularly valuable. I would suggest, for example, Real Clear Politics, which many of you may read, which is actually a compilation of the articles of the previous 24 hours, which the compilers deem to be useful because they are intelligent, they're well written, they are factually accurate, and they come from a variety of different perspectives. So if you look at those, then you can get a fairly good cross-section idea of what's going on. And, you can sort of pick your way through that without feeling that you're being trapped into a particular way of thinking. So my final point is this, that what I've been describing is the media. The media is a terribly important mechanism for determining our cultural parameters, for determining how we think. But ultimately, the media is not the problem. The media is not the source of all this. The media is really the public arm of the intelligentsia, of the people who think. And they are rooted in the universities. And that's where the problem really lies. It's the people who teach our children, and the people who themselves have been taught now for several decades, who have been taught to despise the West and who've been taught this groupthink. If you look at the universities in Britain, I think surveys suggest that something upwards of 95%, and I put that at a very conservative estimate, it's probably something more like 98%, are left-wing thinkers. They're progressive thinkers. The number of conservatively minded people, i.e. people who are not the left, in university teaching is statistically insignificant. And I would expect it to be the same, if not worse, here, and it's the same in America. That's where the problem lies. How one deals with that is a very difficult problem, but that's what we're up against. We're up against a culture that has gone off the rails, and the media is merely the public expression of that culture. And if we want to deal with the media, we actually have to work out ways of fighting and winning the culture war that is currently underway. That's all I have to say. I'd be welcome to any questions.
Thank you, Melanie. We'll take some questions. Just a couple ground rules. It has to be a question, not a statement. And second of all, please stay within the bounds of propriety, everyone, okay?
That child in the film, in the Paris culture, was he dead?
Was the child in the Mohammed al-Dura child, was he dead? Well, he wasn't dead by the end of the film. Whether he was dead afterwards is another matter. No one knows what's happened to him. I did try and follow that up. And he just vanished. We have no idea whether he's dead or alive now, but at the end of that France 2 film, he was certainly alive.
When
when I listen to you speak, it makes me think Church of Scientology. We live in a culture of a cult, whereas if you don't drink the spiked Kool-Aid, you are a pariah. But when you mention the notion of religion, Western religion based on the Bible, we haven't applied that same contempt to the Quran. In fact, we've bent over backwards. And so I wonder, is it not really the case of our confusion of kindness with absurdity? We want to all feel that we're kind, we want to feel kindness, we want people to think of us as kind, and so we enter the absurd. Like in 9/11, we say, aren't silent about Islam, we say Islam is all about peace, even though we know that there's a problem of violence with Islam.
Well, the problem. So we've turned against our own biblical precepts while effectively embracing or being indifferent to the dangers of the Quran. I think that's broadly what you're saying, the two go together in this way. And this is very complicated. This very complicated argument, but basically the two go together in this way: that by disengaging ourselves from the truths of the Hebrew Bible, we have pretended to ourselves that that there must be no differentiation made between cultures, and that anyone who makes any kind of differentiation, any kind of attempt to make a hierarchy of cultural values, is intrinsically racist and discriminatory. And that the West is intrinsically racist and discriminatory because it's always had power. And so it's used its values to oppress those without power. This is very much a Marxist analysis of the world. It's all framed in terms of power and powerless. It's complete garbage. But unfortunately, this is now the orthodoxy on the progressive side, as a result of which the developing world can do no wrong. And consequently, it cannot. The developing world is the victim, the historic and actual and present-day victim of the developed world. And because it's a victim, it is morally pure. It can do no wrong. It cannot be held responsible for its own actions. And consequently, you cannot criticize it for what it does or what it thinks. That is merely to prove that you, the developed world, are intrinsically racist and exploitative and oppressive. That's why we have Islamophobia, that we cannot condemn or criticize. So we have a kind of double whammy going on. Do you have a double whammy in Canada? A double blow. That we have deprived ourselves in the West of the underpinnings of our own culture. We are sawing off the branch on which we sit, because it is from the Hebrew Bible that we get our galvanizing ideas about real human rights, based on respect for every person who lives, and all good things, putting other people first and all the rest of it. So we don't want that. And at the same time, we've told ourselves we cannot say that that culture is any better than any other, and consequently we have to embrace other cultures. Otherwise, we will be discriminatory towards them. And so we've hollowed out our own defences. We're, to mix my metaphor, we're sawing off the branch on which we sit. And the Islamists, who understand perfectly, two things. They understand what the West has done to itself in hollowing out its own culture. So it no longer knows what it believes, and it's certainly not prepared to die for what it believes. It understands the West is hollowed out, and it also understands that without the religious underpinnings, a culture is nothing. And Islam knows that better than anything else because it's all about the religion. And so it's moving in. And the West is paralyzed and powerless. It cannot deal with this because it doesn't know how the rules should apply. It can't square in its mind its very decent desire to be fair and just and tolerant to other peoples and other cultures, which in my book is how we should be, and to allow people the space to practice their private religious beliefs. I believe that a liberal society has to do that. It has to make that space, and it has to make that space for Muslims who believe what they believe. But because it believes that, it's confused that very proper liberal template of tolerance. It's confused that with the idea that you cannot set any boundaries at all without being discriminatory. So you can't say, for example, as in Britain, that we're not having Sharia law. Why? Why should we say that in Britain and in Canada? Because Sharia law is where, the rubber hits the road. Sharia law is where a minority stops saying, we just like the ability to be able to practice privately our religion and our culture, which they should be able to. That minority is saying, we require our laws to be equal to your laws, at the very least, if not take over. But let's say the very least, equal to your laws. And what that means is that the fundamental bedrock principle of a Western liberal democracy, which is everybody lives under the same law, one law for all, that can't be. So in and of itself, Sharia law breaks that bargain, that liberal bargain, that bargain of a liberal society. So that's, in my view, where the line should be drawn, for example. But where we are is that to say this, I can tell you, outside these hallowed halls, I hope nobody is tweeting my remarks, otherwise I'll be in trouble, I would be accused immediately of Islamophobia for saying that a line should be drawn against Sharia law.
The Church of Canterbury said that 10 years ago. He said he was all in favor of Sharia law being incorporated in English law.
He did. He is no longer the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he did indeed say that. And the Church of England has a particular problem in this regard for all kinds of reasons. It thinks that by saying this kind of thing, it will protect Christians from being attacked and slaughtered and overwhelmed. And it couldn't be more wrong. So that's the confusion of the times. We can't see where we should. To preserve a liberal society, you have to draw the line in the sand. And we're not drawing any lines in the sand. That's the problem.
Was an internationally known jurist. He used to say that you have to read papers from the different positions. Right-wing papers, left-wing papers, and when you did that, you have an idea of what, might really be the facts.
Okay, so the suggestion is if you read right-wing papers and left-wing papers, then you can get a good idea of what the facts actually are. It's a nice thought, but it's not true, because the right-wing papers are terrible as well. Because, for various reasons, what do we mean by right-wing? We mean they adopt a free market position, they are in favour of capitalism and all that kind of stuff, whatever. But they are nevertheless, and this speaks to the problem I think that conservatism has in the West. It no longer knows what it is that it has to conserve. This is why you had the problem in America of rhinos, why Trump became Trump, because the Republicans didn't know what it was to be conservative anymore, why in Britain we have a conservative prime minister who is enforcing, safe spaces and speech codes and all the rest of it, because she thinks that to be a person of conscience means that you have to be left-wing. This is a conservative prime minister. And as far as the newspapers are concerned, they are staffed overwhelmingly in Britain. I can only speak for Britain. But those that sort of support the Conservative Party at a general election, they are overwhelmingly staffed by journalists who subscribe to many of the kind of liberal left-wing shibboleths that I've been talking about. And they are themselves very confused. So I'm afraid that simply won't do. Certainly the broad point that you're making is that read as widely as possible over a variety of viewpoints. That is obviously a sensible thing to do. But to think that if you read simply, conservative newspapers on the one hand and liberal left-wing newspapers on the other, you're going to arrive at the truth of a situation, I'm afraid that is simply not the case. And the reporting of Israel, for example, you look at conservative-run newspapers in Britain, to a newspaper, they put in lies. Because in large measure, they are, as I've suggested in my earlier remarks, they are quite heavily dependent on the news agencies, which service all of them, and which are themselves captured by propaganda.
Hi, so I'd be interested in your comments. I've been finishing a great book by Douglas Murray, The Strange Death of Europe, who touches a lot of what, I think you two are on the same page.
We are friends.
Yeah. And and he talks also about not just where they say, oh, here's the story that you have to get, but he also talks about they're not allowed to report the truth. It was the Rotherham sex scandal, which would make anybody's blood boil if they're familiar with it. And in the media, how they're just not allowed to report in Europe about statistics and about rapes, and it was just, I just want to be interested in your thoughts and comments on it.
The Rotherham sex scandal is a very interesting and good case in point. As you say, it was a horrific thing. To those who don't know what this was the discovery by my own newspaper, The Times of London, about 2 or 3 years ago, of a situation which had been allowed to exist for more than 10 years, in which gangs of overwhelmingly Pakistani heritage Muslim men were going out and enticing, sometimes kidnapping, but basically grabbing hold of very young white girls. They targeted white girls, mainly from fairly chaotic homes. They were very vulnerable girls. A lot of them were in the care of the local authority. And they pimped them in the most appalling way. They tortured them, they raped them, they abused them, they handed them from man to man per night. And under the eyes of the authorities, the police and the social welfare authorities. And why was it under their eyes? For two reasons. First of all, particularly in the police thought these girls were what's called in Britain little scrubbers, little prostitutes, because they were girls from bad homes. And the police just thought, well, they're into sexual activity at the age of 12, 13. They're trash. They're trash. So what, they're saying they're being raped? Give me a break. I've got better things to do. That was the police. And the police, and particularly the social welfare services, decided that to investigate these gangs was racist. They didn't think it was Islamophobic. They thought it was racist because they were Pakistanis. And consequently, it was allowed to continue, and this was in one town, in Rotherham, one town. And I've forgotten now the figure, but it was thousands of girls. And it's going on, it was going on, and it is going on in towns up and down the country. So there are hundreds of thousands of girls. Now, nobody could write about it or talk about it. I didn't know the scale of this, but I knew there was a problem. Because I kept getting, on social media, on the net, I kept getting stuff sent to me which referred to it. Now, the only people who were referring to it were people who were associated with two groups. One was the British National Party and one was the English Defence League. And they're both considered to be, rightly or wrongly, let's not get into that at the moment, they were considered to be neo-Nazi groups, far, far, far right. Haters, fascists. And consequently, anybody who raised the idea that there might be a problem with these overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslim pimping gangs was immediately said to be of the far right, associated with Nazis. And so nobody could talk about it. It toxified the entire debate. And it took my colleague at the Times, who investigated all this over a long period of time, to bring it out. And then he and the Times got accused of Islamophobia, of racism, and all the rest of it. As a result of that reporting, dozens and dozens of Pakistani Muslim heritage men have been tried and convicted, and more are being tried all the time. But the problem still goes on, because even though it's been exposed and even though it's been talked about and dealt with in the courts, the stigmatizing power of this term Islamophobia is so paralyzing and so total that virtually nobody will talk about. And that's what Douglas was kind of talking about, that bad things are happening because people are terrorized by the threat that they perceive to their own livelihoods, their professional careers, their social standing, their friendships, and not to mention actual threats of physical violence against them. And it's all true. It's all true. That is what happens to you if you put your head above this parapet. And so the number of people who are writing and talking about this is necessarily very small. But the people out there, the populace in Britain and in Europe, are listening carefully. They are very often the people living in communities which are being terrorized. They see what's happening in their own streets. And they know two things. They know that what's happening is frightening, bad, terrible, and a threat to them and their families. And they know that people like them, for saying such a thing, will be deemed to be racists and worse, Nazis. And so they've kept quiet because they're the ordinary people. But when given the chance, they show their feelings. And they showed their feelings, they're showing their feelings in Europe. In Europe, the same thing is happening, but in a different scale, different context. It's much, much more violent in countries like France and Sweden. It's a different situation from Britain. All these countries are different from each other. But what you can see is that overall, you have this increasing revolt by the people against their whole political establishment, which has, in the people's view, abandoned them. Not only has it abandoned them, but has actually said, you have no right to say that you want to hold on to your own benighted racist Western culture because that's white, and that's ethno-nationalist, and it's nativist, and that is fascist. And that's why you're voting for all these fascist parties. So every political party in Europe that says, excuse me, we think that we actually want Europe to be Europe, they are being damned and denigrated as fascists and Nazis. Now, some of them are. They were formed by people who were Nazis, and they remain bad people. They remain bad people. They remain people who hate all Muslims. They hate all people of colour. They hate Jews. They are still bad people. But alongside them are parties which are not like that, which are just saying, we don't want to have Europe Islamized. We want Europe to be Europe. And they're all lumped together. But the people are just voting, taking them as a group. What the people are voting for, whether they are bad or good people in themselves, these political parties, what the people are voting for is for Europe to remain Europe. And so the fight is on. The fight is on. The political establishment is nowhere. The political establishment is still digging itself further into the hole in Britain and in Europe. But the people are ahead of them. And it's not going to be pretty in Europe. It is not going to be pretty because Europe won't go down without a fight. And it will be bloody and horrible. And I have no idea what the end product will be, but it will be a fight.
Did you still have a question in the back? You, the gentleman in the back. You. Yeah.
I'm wondering, do you think that the media is justified in rejecting certain topics for debate? So the example you gave is that the media won't permit someone who denies, someone who's against global warming. So if somebody wanted to come on who would assert that blacks aren't equal or Jews control the world, do you think that those are proper subjects for debate as well? Or do you think that there has to be a distinction between those topics which are sort of societally accepted and those subjects which, would be
okay. Do I think that every topic should be open for debate, including, for example, the idea that black people are inferior or Jews are a conspiracy to take over the world? And the answer is no, I don't. And it's a difficult line to police where the line is. But I think that I think the point about, I think we're living through a period where language has become hijacked, so words no longer mean what they should mean. One word is justice, which has come to mean injustice in many respects. It's because it's all conceived in terms of power. And another word is prejudice. Now, people think that people who speak harshly about others are prejudiced. And what I think people don't take on board is that, in my book, true prejudice, true bigotry, is basically it departs completely from any concept, any reasonable concept of reality. It has absolutely no anchorage in evidence whatsoever. And so if you say black people are inferior, that is an unpleasant opinion which has no anchorage in reality. If you say Jews want to take over the world, that has no anchorage in reality. It is a derangement. And so in certain, so that is a kind of marker of bigotry. And the second element of where I think the line should be drawn is that bigotry, if it's directed at people, has the capacity to incite people to hurt those people. And certainly that kind of attitude to black people or to Jews or to anybody else based on assertions which are simultaneously have no element of reality attached to them at all and have the capacity to inspire the kind of hatred that makes people want to go and hurt them, that cannot be allowed. We cannot have a situation where we tolerate behaviour which hurts other people. I mean, it's the classic liberal definition that, you allow everything to be said or everything to be said or done unless somebody else is hurt. And these lines are difficult to establish sometimes, but I think that's a general principle, that everything else should be permitted. And that's where the line should be drawn. It should be drawn very narrowly, but it should be drawn, but it should be drawn very narrowly, my view.
Yes, you used the term several times, decent, to talk about people who are decent.
Did I? No.
You did, several times. And allowing that the people who have a progressive point of view or really hope for peace so they're decent people. And other times one often hears well-intentioned. You didn't use that term, but that's also used in the same category to talk about those who are mistaken Marxists or mistaken supporters in the 30s of Stalin or something. They were well-intentioned, whatever. But we also talked about Islamophobia as a way to cut people off. And is it not possible that referring to people who have supported Stalin, for instance, or today supports people who want to kill me and my children and grandchildren, that is in Israel, to refer to them as decent is making a category mistake.
So you're referring to whom as decent? I've lost you.
The left in the media, the left who have bought into certain ideas, who are basically fundamentally well-intentioned but mistaken. I'm suggesting that to support murderers is not so. Would you not agree that we need stronger language about this supposed decency of people, say, the gentleman brought up the pimping that goes on, as doing it because concerned about their careers and all, for various reasons, not wanting to be labeled as a racist, Islamophobe, whatever. Do we not need stronger language to attack these people? Because just as, well, for the
You're
obvious
referring
reasons.
to cowards, basically.
Yes.
That's it.
I certainly would not say, and if I gave the impression that I have given a wrong impression, that people who stick up for murderers or people who do terrible things are decent. I don't mean that at all. What I'm saying is decent is the idea that one should be tolerant of people's desire to give private expression to their own cultural and religious beliefs. That is a decent idea. The people who say that, therefore, we must not criticize Islam because it's Islamophobic, I don't call them decent. I call them stupid and dangerous. So I'm defining decency rather different. I think there are decent instincts in people, including on the left, decent instincts that they want to make life better for others, but that the expression of those decent instincts gets terribly twisted and perverted. And I also think that the amount of decent instincts among ideologues on the left is actually very small, because they purport to be decent. They say, look at me, I care about the poor and dispossessed of the world. But actually what they care about is themselves. It's all narcissism. What they care about is being seen to care. It's virtue signalling, we call it in Britain. I don't know whether you have that in Canada. It's not just wearing your heart on your sleeve, but it's wearing on your sleeve the heart that you don't have. Because actually what you're concerned about is how you look to others and how you look to yourself. And we can see this because, feminists. Do we hear feminists going on and on, Me Too, about women who are oppressed in the Arab and Muslim world? Do we hear, people whose hearts bleed for the Palestinians jumping up and down when Palestinians throw gay Palestinians off the tops of tall buildings? Of course we don't. They don't care about those people at all. What they care about is being seen to care. And in my view, if one wants to counterattack against this terrible onslaught on real decency, we all have to realize that what motivates these people is narcissism, and that's their Achilles heel. Because if we can make them seem to themselves on their own ground, on their own terms, to be the thing they most hate, stupid, risible, you laugh at them, make them figures of fun, racist, they support ethnic cleansing in a future state of Palestine, no Jew in it. That's what they support. They're racist. You get them on their own terms because it's all about themselves, how they see themselves. And I can tell you, one-to-one, it has a very satisfying outcome.
We have time for one more.
I want to ask you, I'm using the Mohammed Dura case as an example, but there's thousands of others. I'm just wondering if you think there's a role for private citizens in different countries to sue the media for the consequences of their false stories.
Is there a role for lawsuits against the media for the consequences of false stories?
If you can prove the consequences.
I think not. You can't prove the consequences. You can't prove cause and effect. I can tell you what I think, but I can't prove it. I couldn't prove it in a court of law. I can't, produce the evidence of, here is our star witness from Al Qaeda. Yes, I beheaded the following 25 million people because of Mohammed al-Dura. It's not going to happen. It doesn't work like that. So I'm in favour of lawsuits where appropriate, where there is law that can be activated in this way. I'm in favour of using the law to hold bad people's feet to the fire. But I think that in practice, the ability to do so is limited. And when it comes to the media, you're dealing with cause and effect that can't be proved in a court of law, I would suggest. So I don't think it's a very effective tactic in that limited sphere, unfortunately. Whenever.
Thank you.
All right, that wraps up our event for now. We're going to be around. Thank you all so much for coming. It was a great event. Thank you so much, Melanie, for coming into Canada to talk with us. We very much appreciate that. It's an important thing, especially in these times. And if you guys want to fill out your cards, if you haven't filled it out, please do so now and leave them with Shirley Ann, who does everything. All right, thank you so much. Enjoy lunch.